Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Dean, I don't know, well, I guess I do kind of know what it's like where you are, but we've been snowed in down here in the Midwest for days. I'm going a little stir crazy.
Yeah, we've been snowed in here in Toronto as well, but I don't know. I feel like I'm enjoying it, but I also don't have like any real responsibility apart from working from home. So
Well, my son also has some days off school, so we've just been trying to keep it cool in any way we can here. We were throwing snowballs. That was a good time. And when we're not doing that, we've been playing all of the DLC from Zelda Breath of the Wild. And we are more committed than ever to get this Zelda dirt bike in this game. It's gonna be great.
It is going to be great. My wife is also doing that right now, but she is. She told me she doesn't like the dirt bike because it takes her out of the immersiveness of the world. So she's going to earn it, but then not use it, and I really respect that.
That's very funny. Here's the thing about the dirt bike that you got to know that will make it feel more immersive. Hyrule is a place where dirt bikes exist, and once you get that under your belt, it's like, yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, there are more
This
advanced
makes
technologies in that game than dirt bikes, I guess.
Yeah, it's cool. It's the same dirt bike that you get if you play Mario Kart 8. So there's a lot of great interconnectedness in the Mario cinematic universe.
That's good. Well, welcome again to the Magnificast, a podcast about about what video games we're playing right now. No, we're not doing it that time. We're not doing this that time.
All right, folks, let's get into it. On this podcast, we read a lot of books. And this week is no exception. We're reading a book that Dean and I both like a whole lot. And that's something. We read so many books, and some of them are bad. Some of them are real stinkers. But this time, we read a good one. So this week, let's see. We'll talk about it more in a minute, but we're going to talk very explicitly about a book called Revolutionary Forgiveness, Feminist Reflections on Nicaragua by the Amanecida Collective. It's a really neat book, and we'll talk about it a lot in a minute, but that probably gives away already what we're going to be talking about in this episode. The Nicaraguan Revolution. When it comes to Christianity and the left, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about, a lot of great history. And if you don't believe me, do I have 250 episodes of a podcast for you to listen to? But if you do believe me, great. One of the most interesting things in that long history of Christianity and the left, or however you want to frame that particular niche, is, I think, the Nicaraguan Revolution. It's super interesting. It's a historical moment that we always find ourselves coming back to on this podcast. Maybe it's not the most important. I don't know. But to me, it seems like one that is incredibly important, or at least it's very important for my own brain and my own sort of self-understanding of what religion and politics working together might look like. So we will talk about the specifics of Nicaraguan Revolution in just a minute. But broadly speaking, it's a really interesting time to look at if you are interested in the ways that politics and Christianity can mutually inform one another in a, pretty overt revolutionary situation. Like I've said, we talked about Nicaragua a lot before in this podcast. We talked about Ernesto Cardenal, one of the sort of main figures not the main figure in the revolution necessarily, but definitely an important figure in the post-revolutionary society for sure. And we've talked about the revolution more broadly. We reference it probably every other episode, I would imagine. But anyways, we found a pretty interesting, not new, but new to us, a pretty interesting new to us book that offers up a really unique perspective on the revolution with regards to Christianity and also with regards to feminism. So that's pretty wild. So yeah, this week we're going to do a little bit of a book report on this great book, once again, called Revolutionary Forgiveness, Feminist Reflections on Nicaragua, written by the Amanecida Collective. That is a name I will probably say wrong 1,000 times in this podcast. Well, anyways, a book report. Maybe you're already reaching for the pause button on your phone. Maybe you're already unplugging your headphones. You don't want to listen to something about a book because you're listening to a podcast for a reason. But I promise, if you stick with us, you'll hear some of the very interesting observations that a handful of theologians make about the revolution and forgiveness. Those are the two big themes that we're going to probably be talking through: revolution and forgiveness. And we'll talk about how those ideas play out in the Nicaraguan Revolution in particular, but also about how forgiveness, I think, is kind of the big one. How forgiveness ends up being like a very political idea in ways that you might not think about it in your everyday life, right? Forgiveness for a lot of Christians, especially in evangelical Christians in North America, it means, a very individualistic type of forgiveness. You go up to the altar, you get saved, Jesus forgives you of your sins, and that's great. But in this book, it works out a little bit differently, and you are gonna want to hear about how I feel like I'm a car salesman right now when I say all that. Anyways, the book is super interesting. It's definitely a cool way to reflect on a wild historical moment. But beyond the historical aspect, I think the book is really instructive in how it parses out some pretty hard ideas around revolutionary violence, around conversion, what it means to really take up a cause, and also around forgiveness and how that works out in politics. So I don't want to sell this book short as being a boring book report on a podcast, but I do want to say it's a very cool book. It's just been recently republished, I guess, by Wolfenstock, and you should go read it if you're interested in liberation theology, because I don't know, it's a perspective you're not going to hear in many other places.
Yeah, and I think too, just to maybe explain why this book and not so many others on Nicaragua. I mean, they're all good. All the books on Nicaragua are good. You know,
Except they're bad. Except the
the
bad
bad
ones.
ones
Those
are
are bad
bad. Yeah.
ones. Yeah, of course.
But we've talked about some books on this podcast before. Lots of Ernesto Cardenal books about Nicaragua. We've talked to some pretty interesting folks who have sort of histories or studies of Nicaragua, like just in the last year, we talked with Stephen Hennigan, for example, about a great book he wrote about Ernesto Cardenal and some other interesting kind of literary figures in the revolution. We talked to Margaret Randall about her experience in the Nicaraguan Revolution. So there's lots of good stuff, but this book is so unique because just kind of as a form or a genre, it is written in this collective way. So it's written by basically 13 people, 12 women and one man. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's so cool because it is a sort of on the ground reflection that really picks up a lot of theological themes from these solidarity trips to Nicaragua. And then they're kind of reflecting back on what that means for them as U.S. citizens in particular. And I think that is such a cool approach to a book, both a theology book and a book about the Nicaraguan Revolution, right? Because it's sort of making that history active, making that moment active. And I think it's like a really cool model. I wish there were 1,000 books like this for many other countries. So anyway, we'll get to more of that in a moment. But first, we should probably talk a little bit about the Nicaraguan Revolution itself, maybe to like set the stage a bit.
Let's do it.
All right, so the first thing you got to know about the Nicaraguan Revolution is everything that happened before that we got there, before we got to the revolution. Why did they need one in the first place? And I'll try my best to summarize a lot of history in a brief amount of time. We'll see how it goes. So Anastasio Somoza was the big bad president of Nicaragua during the Sandinista Revolution. So he's the enemy. He's the bad guy that gets everybody finally riled up enough to have a revolution. But he was actually the latest in a family dynasty of violence that had ruled the country since 1936. So a long time to be ruled by the same family. That family gained power after killing Augusto Sandino, who was like a kind of peasant folk hero who led a rebellion against a U.S. occupation of Nicaragua. So the United States had already been occupying that country for a long time. In fact, Dorothy Day, one of the founders of the Catholic Worker, had done some solidarity work around Sandino in particular. Pretty interesting U.S. connection. So that made the Somoza dynasty anyway a loyal U.S. ally because they, disposed of Sandino. And Sandino also became a symbol of resistance. So there's this kind of long tension already built into that country. The Somozas had presidential power, but even if they were out of the office, they would hold, I guess, sort of power strings because they were massive landowners and they continued to control the National Guard. So they always had power in one way or another, whether it was militarily, electorally, or through being basically the primary landowners in the country. And their rule was definitely marked by inequality, as you could guess, but also torture and executions. Maybe the example I always gave when I would teach about the revolution is Anastasio Somoza himself was a part owner of a company that took the blood of poor Nicaraguans and sold it to the United States. So literal vampiric capitalism.
Somehow that's not the grossest thing that he did either, which I think is kind of surprising.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of that in this book too. Some tough stories to stomach, but yeah, it's brutal. So, inspired by the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, in Algeria in the 50s, a bunch of people and organizations founded their own FLN, or National Liberation Front, in Nicaragua in 1961 to try to oppose Somoza. And later they added Sandino's name to it to become the FSLN, or in English, the Sandinista National Liberation Front. So, really calling that original opposition to U.S. occupation in mind. And the FSLN, they were an armed movement, right? So they carried out a bunch of dangerous, violent missions for a while. And at first, that was really repellent to a lot of Christians. There was like a lot of debate in Nicaragua about whether or not that was the right thing, and also a debate within the left, right? Like the communist movement was not part of the FSLN at first, and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, the FSLN also created some other opportunities for like protest and demonstrations and that sort of thing, and got involved in urban organizing and working with the workers movement and stuff. So kind of expanded that growth to become a more invitational movement. And over time, the FSLN actively invited Christians in particular to participate, which kind of like came at exactly the right moment when liberation theology in Latin America in the 60s and 70s was like getting going. So when the revolution was like obviously going to win in 1979, even the bishops of Nicaragua made it a point to endorse the armed struggle using principles from papal documents, which is pretty wild. In November of that year, they released a pastoral letter endorsing socialism. So even in the hierarchy was moved at least to make that statement. And the revolutionary government included 4 priests and a bunch of lay Christians as well. Base communities, which are kind of like the organizational unit of liberation theology, they were super important, building popular support for that revolution. And then after the revolution succeeded, so that was 79 and Jimmy Carter was the president, when Reagan took over, the US began funding a really brutal civil war against the revolution throughout the 80s. There's a lot of kind of euphemisms for it. Sometimes it's called like the Dirty War or the Contra War, or lots of names. But anyway, if you've ever heard about the Contras, that is who they're talking about. It's a kind of paramilitary right-wing force of basically fascists who Ronald Reagan sent millions and millions and millions of US dollars to, and Congress too, not just Reagan, a lot of very bad Congress people as well did that. And there was a bunch of bad scandals. The Iran-Contra affair is part of that. Money laundering through it. The drug trade was a part of it. Lots of really gross, shady things that Reagan did. But anyway, that's the revolution in brief. It takes us up to the point where this book appears in the mid 80s. So right in the thick of the Contra War, and kind of on the one hand celebrating the victory of the revolution with that long history dating all the way back to Sandino, but also in the middle of a massive sustained imperialist opposition campaign by their own government, the Reagan government.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Pretty good. Pretty good history in, I don't know, a few minutes.
Thanks. You can turn that one into your animatic on YouTube.
That's what we need, is an animatic of you talking about the Contras. Okay. So yeah, this book all takes place kind of in the early 80s. It is, well, here, I'll tell you about the book kind of conceptually. But right, it's taking place in the 80s. These 13 people, who again are mostly women, they're from North America. They make up this thing called the Amanecida Collective. They write about a series of trips that they took to Nicaragua. And I think there was maybe like 5 or 6 in total. Some of them went more than that. Some of them, I don't know, didn't. But anyways, this group of people from North America who all have kind of like a theological education in one way or another, from a whole handful of different types of religious backgrounds and faith backgrounds. There's, I don't know, a Unitarian Universalist. There's a bunch of Episcopalians. There's Moravian. There's a few Roman Catholics. All of our faves. They're all in there, I guess. Even some of our not so faves, but it doesn't matter. Anyways, the book is really fascinating because, let's see, it's the observations and lessons that they pull from meeting with these Christian-based communities, from meeting with people like Ernesto Cardinal, like meeting with like Tomas Borges, who is like the leader of the FSLN, and also just meeting with a bunch of just regular Nicaraguan people, right? Like that's just like all of these kind of people. They're meeting with them. They're asking them about what's happening in the country, what they think about it. They're asking them about their faith and how that kind of plays into it. So that's all fascinating, but it's all happening in the background of the early 80s. So, it's not like it's not like the revolution is over. It's like, people at one point in the book, they mention, that people still in their front yards have, like, trenches that they've dug because, like, who knows when the Contras will show up and, like, start shooting people again. So it's like, they're making these observations that are sort of, like, theologically and politically important, but they're doing them in the background of a country that's, like, still very much under siege by, US-funded right-wing death squads. So a pretty intense sort of, like, slice of history and, like,
Mhm.
way to talk about it. It's also really interesting, noting how the book is written. It's sort of unusual, I suppose. Usually you have, a single author and they're kind of just telling you something or another, or, they're, synthesizing a bunch of different people's takes into a book, but this is different. So the chapters are split up into thematic sections, with, like, sort of some narration in them. There's, an intro by Dorothy Zuela, which is great. But there's a section on conversion, a section on revolution, a section on forgiveness, and then a conclusion about, like, what you do with this information. But the cool thing about the book is that the narration is always kind of relying on bits of personal writing and reflection from members of the collective around these topics. So, like, the book is like trying to sew together a bunch of diverse opinions and ideas and thoughts and takes all at once. And it is such a cool way to write a reflective book like this because you get, like, instances where the members of the collective are bringing different observations or even outright disagreeing with one another about what they think is happening or what they think is, what should be drawn from this kind of thing. So it's a pretty cool book conceptually, and also it's a great, like, kind of artifact of the time. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, like I said, I wish there were more books like this, just being able to I mean, there's so many things about it that make it really valuable. Like being able to be a voice of a collective is already very interesting, like you get a window into the conversation that's happening among a group of folks who've been together for a long time. You also get, I think, yeah, that diversity of opinion that is so interesting. It's kind of like it's not the same as reading the Gospel in Solentadame, for example, but there's something similar there in that the energy of the dialogue allows different issues to emerge that might not emerge in the same way if you were just like, a philosopher or theologian trying to like make an argument. Like
Yeah.
this is like when they talk about violence, for example, they're talking about an issue that they all have different experiences with, different interests in, and the way that they're going to negotiate that is so different than trying to convince like an imaginary audience or something. So it's really neat, and again, being a product of that solidarity trip or series of trips by different people at different times, it also just kind of reveals so many things. And like I said, I wish more people were able to write this kind of thing. It would be so neat to just have more records of, what do people make when they go to another country. One thing I love doing, like maybe I have too many books like this on my shelf, but like I love reading memoirs of missionaries who have been involved in solidarity work at different points in their life, because like that particular genre just gives you a really unique lens, I think, on things like liberation theology, right? It's not just a bunch of ideas or doctrines or commitments, but it's a living movement with actual human beings involved. And yeah, just having kind of the dispatches of that and having people reflect on it from, my own context as a US citizen or a person in Canada, it makes all the difference for thinking about how we would also relate to something like that. So it's not just, out there somewhere else.
Hmm. Totally. Well, let me give an example about how, like, this particular way of writing a book actually activates theology in a really particular way, and also tells you about history in a way that's, I think, very interesting. Okay, so listeners of this podcast will know I'm not a huge fan of reading theology. I think it's boring and usually it feels very inconsequential. But this book makes me feel very convicted about it. Maybe I'll feel differently about it. Or maybe if there are more theology books written like this one, I would feel differently. But okay. Anyways, so I mentioned a minute ago that the very first chapter is about conversion and the second chapter is about revolution. And those two chapters are really intensely interconnected, in a way that I think is, at least was to me, a bit surprising, or it didn't initially make sense to my brain, but then I got into it and I figured it all out. So instead of reading an excerpt from the section on conversion, though, I want to talk about the section about revolution because it kind of brings them together in this way that is super helpful for me to think about them. Okay, so conversion. If you're not a church person, Again, great for you. Living, I guess, an amazing life, unsettled by the psychic damage that the church has given me. But the conversion, when we think about it in the context of evangelicalism, we think about it in the context of conservative Christianity or just North American Christianity. It is like about a commitment that you yourself are making to God, to church, one of these things, right? I mean, for evangelicals, it means that you were at summer camp and somebody gave an altar call and you went up there and you converted, you gave your life to Jesus Christ, and what a great thing that was, right? There's all kinds of other ways that people talk about conversion. There's a whole kind of conversation around this for sure, but um, to me, it's never been very interesting, I guess, because I don't know, you're supposed to kind of go through this moment, and God does something in you where you're changed, irrevocably. There's something happens to you, and I don't know, I think probably, at least in my case, and I'm sure probably in the case of others, that's not really how it works, right? You're converted for like an afternoon, and then something else happens, and you forget or whatever. Anyways, this book has a lot to do with conversion, and there's maybe a little bit of a different meaning going on here, but it ties in directly with sort of a commitment to a revolutionary society that makes me very excited. All right. This is the very first paragraph of this section on revolution. So the narrator, I mean the collective as a whole, I guess, is writing this part, but they say this: conversion is not the interiorized result of a magical zap by God. We are not spiritual renegades one day and saints the next. Our lives and our faith are more complicated. Conversion is a difficult process of spiritual transformation which involves the turning around of our commitments and priorities as sisters and brothers in the human family. Conversion has to do with where we put our money, time, and our energy. Okay, so conversion is not a thing that happens all at once. It's a thing that you kind of practice. It's a commitment you take up day after day. Very interesting. I like this. But the part that makes it tie into revolution is kind of the way that they themselves on this trip become converted, right? Not to Christianity, or I mean, maybe to Christianity in a different way of thinking, but to a type of revolutionary project within Nicaragua, to a sort of ideology of, Sandinismo, but also to like a type of Christianity that the people of Nicaragua are expressing in this moment that they find like really connected to the revolution. So that section about conversion is followed right by like one of these excerpts from one of the members of the collective. So her name is Anne, which is not super important, but there it is. Anyways, so they on this trip in Nicaragua, they go and meet with this group of mothers called Mothers of Heroes and Martyrs. So in the sort of moment in the 1980s, this is a group of women who have lost family members to the revolution in one way or the other. So they're all kind of telling these stories about their family that have, like that they've lost. And this is like what starts swaying some of these people, these members of the collective. So I guess I'll read this bit here. The third woman to speak to us said, "After the triumph, my son was the triumph is the end of the revolution. I guess like they oust Somoza. Um, things are still up in the air, but anyways, that's what the triumph means. After the triumph, my son was in the reserve battalion because he didn't want to see the people exploited by the Contras. In 1982, in the mountains, at the age of 18, he fell in combat. They brought my son to me dead. We're still suffering the same way. My son grew up having a gun in his hands." And after that, it says this. This is the reflection from one of from the collective as a whole. What do we know about revolution, we who are North Americans, US citizens? What in our lives prepares us for meeting the people and hearing the stories of revolution in Nicaragua? Many or most people in the United States view revolutions and their causes in abstract and monolithic terms. For instance, believing that all revolutions have their roots in communism or atheism, and that all are somehow caused by the Soviet Union. So they go on to talk about how like these moments of like talking with the mothers of like I guess fallen soldiers and the revolution, it like wins them over. They are committed. It's not like a zap moment, but it is a moment where they there's more of a rupture in their life, and they find this kind of new moment to live differently and to this new revolutionary possibility. I think it's very cool. It's such an interesting way of talking about conversion. It's also such an interesting thing to kind of bring to the table where it's like, what do people in North America know about revolution? Not much. And but how do you become converted? What do you do? What do you do as somebody who lives in the imperial core, hearing these types of stories? And like, what can you do other than being converted by them? Right? Like you're won over. You feel like their cause is maybe now part of your cause.
Yeah, the stuff on conversion is really interesting in this book in general because you're kind of invited to participate in that process with the authors. There are so many stories of them coming to terms with their own identities as white citizens of the US and women in the US, and in some cases, lesbians in the US, really going to a totally different country and trying to parse out, what do those identities mean in a country like revolutionary Nicaragua. And it's so interesting to see them kind of allow all those things to get mixed up together. Like through their own process of conversion, they're able to interrogate their own identities, but they also don't lose their position of criticism as well. We'll talk about that in a minute, maybe. Like they have some really cool reflections on maybe the shortcomings of the revolution in some aspects, but it's really neat to just be able to be allowed to see some of the vulnerability of the authors here, who are really willing to just share what challenged them, what kinds of things they learned up close with the revolution, and figure out what it means to be a person in the United States on the other side of that kind of trip.
Yeah, totally. I mean, they are very vulnerable in their reflections. There are some parts, even in the early on sections of the book, where some of them are very frustrated. I think
Hmm.
with Nicaragua. I mean, and you can kind of see they are very open to telling you that like their privilege is like shining through. They're very annoyed by, I don't know, having to carry around toilet paper, for example, or something, right?
Hmm.
They're pretty open about that. Um, but they also have some really interesting things to say. I mean, this is a um, this book has it's written from this sort of like feminist liberation theology perspective, which I think is very cool. I'm all about it. It does not foreground the role of like capitalism necessarily. I mean, it talks about it. Obviously, you can't really talk about the story without, but it does foreground a lot of really interesting conversations though about racism and sexism, and also like homophobia and heterosexism. There's lots of reflection on that and how it plays out, which is cool. I'm very into it. Um, yeah, I don't know, Dean, do you wanna talk about any of those spots? Maybe we can start talking about the racism section?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the racism section is really interesting. So I mentioned, when they're kind of going through that conversion process, they gain a lot, but they don't give up a kind of critical perspective too. And one thing they're interested in going through Nicaragua is also paying attention to the minoritized people and people on the margins as well. And when in the racism section, they're especially interested in how the revolution deals with indigenous peoples in the region, which was a huge kind of point of conflict. The Sandinista revolution had a number of policies with respect to the Mosquito Indians in particular that were all very complicated, and complicated too by U.S. imperialism, which was also trying to win over indigenous peoples to create a wedge and a rift. And lots of bad policies on both sides. Like, genuinely, this is not liberal both sidesing it. It's like the US government did some very bad stuff to try to weaponize indigenous peoples against the Sandinistas, and the Sandinistas didn't win themselves any revolutionary favor by creating policies that further marginalized indigenous peoples. So, complicated issue, and they wade into that a little bit with some nuance for sure, and in ways that are really interesting. Ernesto Cardenal also talks a lot about that, by the way, the way the Sandinistas did wrong by the indigenous peoples, and also tried to sort of correct course over time. Eventually, they lost the Civil War, so I don't know. Probably did not improve life for indigenous people, as I would guess, in the '90s. But nevertheless, all very complicated, and the collective does a good job drawing it out. I think there are two especially interesting conversations in here. One on sexism, and the other you mentioned on homophobia and heterosexism. Because the book is themed around feminist reflections on Nicaragua, I think that's kind of maybe the strongest material, because that's what the authors are especially good at talking about. When they talk about sexism, for example, they do say that they meet with lots of women, lots of girls, lots of organizing groups working on issues of sexual inequality. And they say that they think the Nicaraguan Revolution is improving their lives. And so the members of the collective are like, that's great. However, they don't, let the revolution off the hook. And for example, I'll just read one paragraph here. They say, it's clear that the Nicaraguan government is working to counteract many of the effects of sexism. However, there are still many problems caused by deeply rooted machismo, which is still very much of a problem. We were keenly aware of all the posters and newscasts we saw featuring the leaders of the country, the 9-man ruling junta. Male faces all the time, not all that different from home. Many of the Nicaraguan women with whom we spoke agreed wholeheartedly with us on the subject of sexism in Nicaragua. As Milieu Vargas, a member of the Council of the State, told us, to call yourself a revolutionary, you really have to accept equality, but in practicality, it's hard. Now we're trying to convince compañeros that it's better to be equal. And then they go on to sort of record a lot of words from Nicaraguan women in particular, pointing out, things they're still working through. And maybe just in the same way that conversion doesn't happen overnight, they're really impressing.
Revolution doesn't happen overnight.
exactly. And you really have to kind of target it at all levels.
Yeah, that's right. There's a section where one of the members of the collective, I can't remember which one now, they were telling the story about how they were visiting a farm or whatever. And the guide that was taking them to the farm was male, was a guy. And he asked some of the women that were there that he told them they should stay in Nicaragua and have babies. And they were like, kind of disgusted by this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a bunch of stories like that too, right? And even of women in Nicaragua being like, my husband left me because I supported the revolution and he didn't, and that was like a flashpoint in our relationship, and I supported it because I thought, I could sort of stand to gain as a woman, right? And my husband didn't like that, right? So like, there's a lot of interesting nuance there as well, but. And even pointing out some conflicts and contradictions where like women who were invested in the Sandinista revolution then felt marginalized by the way that the revolution was not moving quickly enough. And this is a pretty common story I think you hear in a lot of reflections from women in the revolution. Like a lot of leaders in the Sandinista, like the actual fighting of the revolution were women, but they weren't necessarily rewarded with like governmental posts the way that men were. So yeah, really cool to kind of see them parse that out. I mean, not cool as an issue, but cool to have somebody do their homework, I guess.
Draw attention to it.
Yeah,
totally.
The other section that's really fascinating is that one on homophobia. So a few of the members of the collective talk about their experience as lesbians in the United States and in Nicaragua, and they are especially interested in the treatment of gay people there. And I'll read just a little bit from that section too. So they write, it's an indication of some degree of tolerance that there are no laws against homosexuality in Nicaragua. When asked what the difference before and after the revolution was for lesbians and gay men, Milieu Vargas, again, same guy they were just talking to, responded, we haven't paid attention before or now. It's a personal decision. Perhaps now there's a more generous feeling. There's no official policy and no organizational pressure group. They continue, like the collective basically continues to sort of press that issue wherever they go in Nicaragua, and they get like a wide variety of responses. Some that you can probably guess, right? Like some people are like, oh, there's no gay people in Nicaragua, right? Like that's a response they get. Or they get responses from people who say, oh, I don't know, like there's probably gay people who cares, like whatever, they can be gay, but it's like not an issue, which means it's also not a priority, right? Like thinking it through. So you get a lot of interesting kind of mixed perspectives on it, but I think some of the most interesting writing is actually just the reflections from the collective about that, right? Just thinking about their own kind of identities and how that is related to kind of what they're seeing and negotiating. It reminds me too of if you ever read Ernesto Cardenal's travel diary called In Cuba, when he's in Cuba. There are a few sections in there where he is asking around about gay people in Cuba, and you get some similar kind of thoughts where there's people who are like, oh, there's no gay people in Cuba, while there are other people who are recognize gay people are there and see it as a justice issue that they need to be included. So interesting to kind of see some of that in Nicaragua in particular. I think, if I had to have guessed, I would have felt like maybe it was more socially conservative than that. So on the one hand, it's kind of encouraging to see that there's a lot more openness there than maybe I would have wrongly assumed. But also obviously lots of other work to do. So just a cool, very unique window into asking around about a particular group that I don't usually ever hear talked about in the context of the Nicaraguan Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to draw that attention to it. Yeah, I mean, because you don't ever hear about it. There's one of the people, one of the members of the collective. Their name in the book is Margarita, and I like their commentary the best. It's always very interesting. Anyways, there's a section under the homophobia heading where this member of the collective, Margarita, she's like very upset, I think, about I mean, rightfully so, about this like sort of like the hemming and hawing and the weird sort of attitude around gay people.
Hmm.
She identifies herself in the book as, I mean, she's North American, but she has like sort of a Cuban heritage, and she's also a lesbian. So she has like this very interesting response. Not interesting. It's an entertaining response. It's a powerful response. It's a good one, I think. So she is. It's really fascinating because, just like you said, I mean, in Cuba, it's a problem too. During this particular period, she says this: Fidel doesn't know me. I'm different. I'm a lesbian Latina. That is not revolutionary, he says, but I am revolutionary. I'm sexual. Did you see that? You were afraid that I had a Cuban sexuality? I do know. I'm like you. I love women, all women. Anyways, it just goes on, and I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
I mean, that particular period, I don't know, people on the left, I mean, probably including us sometimes, like kind of romanticize how cool it is, because it is cool. But there are these pieces that, we should think more critically about, and that's one of them for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of other interesting stuff in the revolution section, but we have to maybe move on to forgiveness or else I'll never get there. But I do want to pick out two more things. One is their conversation on violence, and the other is a neat little piece of advice from Ernesto Cardenal that they got to U.S. revolutionaries. So the first on violence, they have a great kind of discussion. Violence comes up a lot in the book. It's like the collective is clearly trying to work out what they make of it, and they keep foregrounding it against, in front of like all that history with Somoza. And there's a neat moment where they're all having a conversation. They talk about Gandhi and everything else, and this woman Elaine says, "Nonviolence is a negative term. I prefer something like peace, by whatever means necessary, even if the means are violent. Plus, I think that we need to make a distinction between violence used to exploit people in an oppressive situation and violence used to defend and liberate oneself from a destructive and dehumanizing situation. In my opinion, these two types of violence are not the same thing, and to use the word violence for both situations obscures this. The violence versus nonviolence issue is not an issue for me." And they kind of go on to have a really interesting debate about like the discourse around pacifism in general, and like pacifists who are able to see connections between broader structural issues and ones who can't. And eventually the collective has this kind of really interesting observation where they say, we are critical of certain aspects of the nonviolent movement in the United States. What many of us see as missing in the nonviolence movement of the predominantly white, male, radical Roman Catholic left is a liberation perspective that includes an analysis of the connections among, as Margarita pointed out, again, very cool lady, imperialism, militarism, and capitalism on the one hand, and classism, racism, sexism, and heterosexism on the other. Those of us who work from an explicitly feminist perspective find we cannot accept an analysis that does not take into account the effect of its pronouncements have on the oppressed, particularly on women of all colors and children. So just a super interesting reflection. And I think like it's true, when we think about the face of nonviolence in the US, that conversation is often dominated by white Roman Catholic radical males. There's some other white Roman Catholic women involved for sure too. Dorothy Day and lots of really cool nuns. But, it's worth pointing out that like, I don't know, they went to Nicaragua, they had this conversion experience, and they sort of came back with that by virtue of, that kind of feminist engagement.
Totally. Well, in this revolution section, before we move on, Ernesto Cardinal gets the last word, which is cool. Good for him. I think it's pretty fun, actually. So, they bring this kind of conversation about sort of revolutionary Christians and their role to play in the revolution, which, like Dean said a while ago, they did. Christians did all kinds of things in the revolution, even took up arms, and isn't that fascinating, actually? Anyway, so they brought this to Ernesto Cardenal. And they'd say, Ernesto Cardenal, this is great. We love this idea. But the thing is, have you seen Christianity in the United States? They say. I mean, not really. They don't say that, but basically that's what they're trying to say. Christianity in the United States, it's embarrassing. It's regressive. It is not. There's not a lot of revolutionaries to be found within those movements.
And this is like the thick of Reagan era.
Yeah, exactly. So not as bad as now, but pretty bad. Anyways, so Ernesto Cardinal is trying to push back and telling them, well, the church everywhere has this problem where there are some people who are in the church who are progressive and they want to, do the work of justice, and some people don't. And he kind of says this in a few different ways. And they, the members of the collective are really like, they're really giving Cardinal a hard time. They're like, but like, are you sure? Have you seen these churches in the United States? They are very bad. And Ernesto Cardinal has this kind of this insight, and I think it's on the one hand very simplistic, but a pretty good observation just the same. So this is how it goes. Ernesto Cardinal is quiet for a moment, and then he nods. But you in the United States can be revolutionary, and the progressive revolutionary Christians there, just as here in Nicaragua, know you can. It's the same church throughout the world. There are those who work for and those who work against basic social change. Each of us must decide which side are we on, mustn't we? So Ernesto Cardinal, you could draw statistics about the amount of Christians according to which denomination vote for which party or who are involved in what type of politics. You could pull all those complicated things out. But Ernesto Cardinal just gives us the most simple point that some Christians are reactionary and some aren't. Which one are you going to be? And I appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's good, right? I mean, the conversation about Christianity as a political force in the United States is a very interesting one to have, and I'm here for it, and I want to have them in depth. But on the other hand, when it comes to organizing, when it comes to like doing something, that's really the question you need to be asking yourself, right? That's the question about it's a question about revolution, I guess, in whatever that word might actually mean in the sense of the United States context. But it's also a question about conversion. Which side are you on? Are you on the side that actually wants to do justice, or the other side that doesn't care? And that is, I don't know, maybe a good cap on how conversion and revolution are interconnected ideas.
Yeah, I love it too because it is so tongue in cheek from Cardinal, who does have a good sense of humor for sure. But like, he had lived in the United States for quite a while before moving back to Nicaragua, so it's not like he didn't know what he was talking about. And I think the challenge is a good one to pose, right? Like, I don't know, like before the FLN and when they were in the thick of Somoza and the church was also benefiting from that relationship in a lot of ways, it probably seemed even more impossible there than it would have in the US. So, it's good to pose that very simplistic question sometimes. Which side are you on? The classic one.
It's the most important question, I've got to say. All right. Let's move on to talking about the section about forgiveness. We'll probably have to speed through it a bit because we're already we talked about revolution too long, which is always our problem. All right. So the section that is towards the end of the book is about forgiveness. And it's a really fascinating one with a lot of interesting things. So let me just get right into it. This is how the chapter opens. This is an observation from Laura from the collective. I learned in Nicaragua that forgiveness is a revolutionary virtue. It is revolutionary not because everyone is forgiven or because forgiveness is all in God's hands. Rather, God is part of the revolution. Forgiveness is revolutionary because the former victims of an unjust system, such as that of Somoza, are able to see the systematic character of victimization and recognize thereby their former oppressors also as victims. Those who forgive are prepared to blame the way society was structured rather than simply the individuals who participate in it. The individuals are held responsible primarily for the future, not for the past. They are given a chance to change rather than being cast away. So obviously a pretty revolutionary and also extremely Christian way to think about the idea of forgiveness, but also an extremely challenging one.
Mm-hmm.
In the abstract, this sounds easy. You're gonna hold people accountable for the future, not for the past. You're recognizing the ways that your oppressors are a part of a system of oppression. All cool ideas that I like a lot. I'm a big fan of them. But then the chapter goes on to tell you exactly what the oppressors, who are a part of a system, were up to. And it is kind of hard to stomach. I don't really want to say too much of it on the podcast because it's probably pretty disturbing. You don't need it in your ears. But, things like torture, things like, I mean, child soldiers, it's awful. It's really bad.
Yeah.
But the part of the revolutionary process in Nicaragua was finding ways to forgive the Somozaistas, the National Guard, and figure out like what to do with them or what reconciliation looks like or what forgiveness looks like. And it is tough.
It is tough for sure. It's super tough, but it's also, maybe to summarize it, I mean, they offered the story of Tomas Borge, who was one of the revolutionary leaders. And I think it really stands in for a lot of the other things. I mean, you can read all the bad stuff on your own. But this is a great summary. So they say the story of Commandante Tomas Borge and his torturer has become for our times a parable of forgiveness, no less revealing than Holy Scriptures. After the triumph in 1979, the new Minister of the Interior, Tomas Borge, was visiting the prisons which housed members of Somoza's National Guard, visiting the leaders of those who had tortured and murdered up to 50,000 Nicaraguan women, men, and children during the insurrection. It is reported that on one of his visits to the prisons, Commandante Borge came upon the guardsmen who had tortured him. He was, brutally tortured, by the way.
Yeah.
When the guardsman realized that Borge recognized him, he asked, "What are you going to do to me? What is your revenge?" Borge responded by extending his hand. "I forgive you. That is my revenge." He talks a lot more about it. And also, you can read a great book by Borge called Christianity and Revolution, which is about his own faith and revolution. It's really fascinating. But yeah, I mean, it's a good kind of stand-in parable, I guess, for the kind of courage of the revolution as a whole, really contained in that one moment.
hmm Yeah, here's one more thing to illustrate this, maybe, I guess, just a bit more. Okay, this is in an observation from one of the members of the collective named Laura, who went to a prison in Nicaragua. She went to sort of like a medium security prison. They talk about this quite a bit. Anyway, so she says this: the 50 inmates of this unguarded, unfenced prison cooperative were members of Somoza's National Guard and/or the CIA-backed Contras. The prisoner who spoke with us was one of Somoza's bodyguards. The man's violent past was beyond question, but there he stood, speaking with love about his country, his family, his fellow prisoners, and his future. I was screaming inside. How can he be forgiven? How can the poor of this country, of any country, forgive? I began to question my own work with prisoners. Laura, you learn later, is a person who's interested in prison ministry. So it's interesting, a vulnerable moment.
Mm-hmm.
I began to question my ability to forgive myself, an upper middle class white woman, and I began to ask myself, what is prison ministry? What is forgiveness? If we incarcerated all the wealthy, greedy business people and all the members of the Reagan administration and Mr. Reagan himself, would I still be interested in prison ministry? Would I care if these people lived or died? My answer after our experience in Nicaragua and after a lot of thought is yes, because I now recognize that ministry with the oppressor is also a part of the process of systemic change. This is such a interesting thing. I mean, I feel like this is not too far off from some things we've said in the podcast even last week, right? Like the whole point of loving your neighbor or loving your enemy, right, is to make sure that they can't hurt other people or hurt themselves because, forcing people into poverty twists your soul up in all kinds of bad ways and it makes you a really horrible person and probably hard to live with yourself. But this observation is maybe along the same lines, but I think it draws out just how like difficult that type of work is, and it's definitely not something that happens overnight. Um, it's also worth saying too, prisons are very complicated things, especially in a post-revolutionary situation. But given the picture of prisons that they paint in this book are radically different than anything in the United States, I guess. Rehabilitation. I'm not like trying to be an apologist for prisons or anything, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there's like a real different idea about what incarceration is about in this sort of post-revolutionary situation that is worth drawing out a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's actually very hard to have this conversation in abolitionist circles, but it is important. I think, I could be wrong about this. My feeling is abolitionists haven't really gotten around to having this very hard conversation in a big way, but maybe one day they'll have to. But it is complicated. Like, I don't like prisons. I think that they're very bad. They don't do what we think that they do, and so on. I'm an abolitionist. It's all true. But when I talk to people who are involved in Global South stuff, they often think that that is very absurd for lots of reasons. They think it's absurd because, what are you going to do with all of Somoza's National Guard after a revolution? They think it's absurd because, in lots of countries with little resources that do face a threat of fascism, they feel they don't have any other options. And also in countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, the sort of situation is such that they do want their prisons to be rehabilitative. And, whether or not they are, I guess, is kind of up for people to decide. But you do get stories in here that kind of suggest that the prison is more of a rehabilitative apparatus. In Ernesto Cardenal's in Cuba, you actually meet a few people who have been through the prison system in Cuba and were rehabilitated in some interesting ways. And that's just kind of them talking about it. Angela Davis herself famously visited prisoners in Cuba, and she herself, was a communist, is a communist in solidarity with countries that also had prisons and so on. And she spent a lot of time talking about mass incarceration in the U.S., but not a lot of time talking about incarceration in those socialist countries. So all that to say, I'm not saying, but what about the good prison or something? So
Yeah, exactly.
don't get me wrong, but what I am saying is it's actually very hard to talk about it with those kinds of situations in mind. And this book is great because it just adds a good wrinkle to kind of to show that we have a lot of work to do to really come up with, none of these are immediate concerns. We don't have a revolution on the horizon in the United States or Canada. It's not anything we have to worry about right now, but it means we have a lot of things to think about. That's all.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, man, we could go on and on. There's about 1,000 more things I actually really want to talk about, but maybe we'll have to do that. We'll have to do it off the air, Dean. Anyways, the conclusion of the book is just as good as the rest of it. It's kind of bringing together all of these observations into a kind of a what should we do kind of moment. And there's a lot of things that we should do, like building solidarity. You should probably do that. You should think about individualism. You should learn about power. You should be able to... you should know how to confess your own wrongdoing. All these kinds of things. They're great. They're great lessons that you can learn from this whole book. And I want to talk about them all, but we can't. But the part I do want to talk about in the conclusion that I think is pretty convicting and I think is worth for people, people on the left to think about, but also, Christians. This is maybe I think this book is full of things that Christians can actually lend to politics in ways that, are kind of missing from the current landscape of the United States. But this is a big one to me, I guess. So there's a section that has the heading called Converting the Oppressor. And here, I'll just read a bit of this. The bonding of the poor and others into a community willing to struggle to overthrow an oppressive regime reveals the power that comes from solidarity. What prevents the community from eventually becoming the oppressor is the community's acceptance of the responsibility to liberate the oppressor as part of its own self-liberation. Therefore, liberation spiritually adheres to a conversion, conversion, revolution, and forgiveness process. From a liberation theological perspective, the people's forgiveness of their oppressors is based on their trust in the relational, communal fabric of both divine and human life well lived. There's some more, I guess, that we could go on to say as well. But I think that's really fascinating to lay out that, that kind of process, I suppose. The conversion, revolution, and forgiveness process is, all of the conversation we just had, aside about prisons, that's like an abolition process, right? That's breaking the cycle of oppression. That's breaking the cycle of, criminality for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Being converted to a type of being in the world where you're in solidarity with other people, accepting that their revolution, that their liberation is a part of your own, and then also understanding that the people that you are overthrowing, that you're liberating yourself from, are people who are hurt by the same system of injustice that you are. That's super important. And I am here for it. And I think that is a particular observation of Christians doing politics that you wouldn't get from, I don't know, other communists.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's interesting too. Like you said, there's 1,000 other things we could talk about in this book, but The way that we didn't really even talk about this much at all. We've been talking about all the stuff you learned about Nicaragua, but the way that the collective also kind of reflects that back on their own read of the United States is also very interesting. You
Yeah.
know, it's a lot of contrast and figuring out, okay, so in Nicaragua, that's a society of revolutionary forgiveness. The United States, though, is not that way. It is a society of they have lots of interesting words for it. It's like, you know, a society of punishment. They talk about the prison system in the U.S. They they refer to Saint Augustine talking about the human race as the massa damnata, and they're like, that is like the United States, right? Everybody is condemned essentially. So it's really interesting to hear them talk about that. It's cool to hear them talk more also about gender issues in the United States, their own kind of experiences in the U.S., and what it means to theologically reflect from a U.S. perspective. So I think that's another contribution to the book that is like worth kind of picking up a little bit more and thinking about it. I mean, the book is like over 30 years old now, right? It was published in 1987 originally, but so much of that stuff just remains the same, unfortunately. And nevertheless, it's really good to kind of see that different model of like theologizing about our situation now. And yeah, it's really neat to just kind of have the ability to be a fly on the wall of like a conversation between, you know, a bunch of women thinking about what it means to be U.S. citizens who have been to Nicaragua a bunch.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, it's such an interesting book because, right, it's about Nicaragua. It's about this like sort of liberation feminist perspective on liberation theology. But I think it has so much to say to, I mean, just our understanding of politics in general. I think it's a great book. I am so energized by it. Honestly, I am really excited to tell other people about it.
Yeah,
I'm gonna put it. I just got added to my church's millennial group chat. I'm gonna tell them all
nice.
about it. I'm gonna become the worst and most annoying person in that group chat.
That's great. That's what you got to do. We got to get this book out there in the group chat for sure. And we got to create a bunch of new writing collectives, and people can go on solidarity trips and write really good books after several trips taken together. So start the work now so that we can all have a bunch of books from different countries in like 10 years. Maybe that should be the big Magnificast writing plot.
Yeah, a great plan. All right, folks. Well, we learned a lot in this episode. We've come a long way since the beginning when we were just telling you about what the Nicaraguan Revolution was about, and now we're at the end and we're learning of big lessons about um, conversion, revolution, and liberation. I'm sorry, conversion, revolution, and forgiveness. Those are the big three. Get them tattooed on your arm and never forget them, like I just did. All right. Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. Or if you don't want to do that, that's fine. You can also just give us a nice iTunes review or a review on some other platform. I'm sure they all count in the grand scheme of things. Maybe not. Who knows? Honestly, it's anyone's guess how the algorithm works, and I certainly don't know. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have